The truck's headlights hit it at 4:41 in the morning, 62 miles north of Coldfoot, Alaska, on the Dalton Highway. It was February 14th, 2021. The temperature outside read minus 31 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough that diesel engines are left running at truck stops for days at a time because a shutdown can mean a fuel line that won't restart. Trucker Darrell Kesson was hauling freight north toward Deadhorse, alone on a road that sees more caribou than cars in the dead of winter, radio silent because the nearest repeater tower was down again. Milepost 222. He remembers the number because he just passed the sign. Something stepped out of the black spruce on the east shoulder and stood in his lane. He said it was massive. Humped shoulders, a low, dark head swinging toward the light, breath coming off it in thick columns of steam that hung in the cold air longer than they should have. He braked, slow and controlled, the way you learn to on ice. The animal did not run. Moose bolt, caribou scatter. Even grizzlies breaking hibernation early tend to flee first and assess later. This animal turned, unhurried, almost deliberate, and walked back into the trees at a pace that suggested it had somewhere to be, not that it was afraid. Kesson had a dash camera, the kind most long-haul drivers run for insurance reasons more than curiosity. The footage exists. It is 11 seconds long, mostly headlight glare and snow glitter kicked up by the truck's own tires. And somewhere in the last 4 seconds there is a dark shape crossing the frame that looks, to some viewers, exactly like a bison. To others, reviewing the same 11 seconds, it looks like nothing at all. Exhaust, low light, a trick of a tired mind at the end of a long shift. Alaska State Troopers logged the call because Kesson, rattled, radioed it in out of habit. Alaska Department of Fish and Game never sent anyone out. There was no second sighting that night, and no tracks were found the next morning. A state maintenance plow had already been through. Kesson posted the clip to a trucking forum 3 days later, asking if anyone else had seen a buffalo on the Dalton. He got 2 replies that mattered. One was a hunter who claimed he'd seen tracks the previous autumn near Wiseman, cloven and enormous, pressed into river mud in a pattern he didn't recognize and couldn't match to anything in his own field guide. The other reply was silence, the kind of silence that, on that stretch of road, usually means someone doesn't want their name attached to a story that sounds insane. Nothing about the Coldfoot sighting was ever resolved. No carcass, no second photograph, no agency press release, no line item in any wildlife bulletin. Just 11 seconds of grainy video and a trucker who has since stopped mentioning it to strangers because he got tired of being laughed at in truck stops from Fairbanks to Prudhoe Bay. Here is what the official record actually says. And it is more complicated than most people assume because Alaska is not a state without bison. It is a state with bison in very specific, very deliberate places, tracked with a precision that makes the gap in that tracking further north stand out even more. Plains bison were brought to Alaska in 1928, when 23 animals were shipped from Montana's National Bison Range to the Delta Junction area and released onto the Delta River flats. That herd persists today. Biologists estimate its size in the several hundreds, managed through a permit hunt specifically designed to keep numbers within what the flats can support each winter. In 1950, a second group was moved south to the Copper River Basin near Katina, establishing a herd in rougher, more forested country. In 1965, animals pulled from the Delta herd were relocated again, this time far into the interior to the remote Farewell area northeast of the Alaska Range, deliberately chosen because it has no road access at all, a control group, in effect, isolated from human contact by geography rather than fencing. And in April 2015, the Alaska Department of Fish and Game released more than 100 wood bison, descended from a captive breeding population maintained for decades, into the lower Innoko-Yukon River region near the village of Shagaluk. It was the first time wild wood bison had walked that ground in roughly a century. Every one of these populations is real, documented, and actively managed. Biologists fly aerial survey transects each spring to count animals against snow-free ground. Hunters report harvest locations and body condition as part of the permit system. None of this is a secret, and none of it is the mystery. If anything, it's the opposite of a mystery. It may be one of the most closely tracked large mammal reintroduction programs in the state. The mystery sits at the edges of the map the agency draws around that tracking. Alaska Department of Fish and Game range maps place all 4 established herds within a defined belt of interior and south-central Alaska: Delta Junction, Kaitina, Farewell, the Lower Inaco, north of the Yukon River, into the Brooks Range foothills and the Dalton Highway corridor. The official position is unambiguous. There is no bison range there, there has never been a release there, and the terrain and distance make an unmanaged crossing implausible enough not to warrant follow-up. When wildlife biologists are asked, informally, about reports like Kesson's, the answer is consistent. Most likely a moose in poor light, or possibly a lone muskox, far from its usual coastal range. Nothing more, and nothing worth a survey flight. That is the frame. Bison exist in Alaska. They do not exist 300 miles north of where the agency put them. Not enough to confirm, not enough to dismiss. That phrase is going to come back more than once before this is over. So the question driving this investigation is not the one most people assume it is. The question is not whether bison exist in Alaska. They do. That was settled in 1928 and reconfirmed in 1950, in 1965, and again in 2015. The question is whether they have quietly crossed a boundary that wildlife managers drew on a map decades ago for herds nobody expected to move that far, and whether anyone would actually know if they had. To understand why that question is even worth asking, you have to stop looking at the map and start looking at the ground itself. The distance from the Farewell Bison Range to the Dalton Highway sighting near Coldfoot is roughly 260 to 300 miles, depending on the route an animal would take. That sounds enormous until you set it against what the same landscape already moves through it every single year, without anyone calling it a mystery. The western Arctic caribou herd migrates over 400 miles between calving grounds on the coastal plain and wintering range in the southern Brooks Range foothills, much of it through exactly this kind of country: river valleys, taiga breaks, treeless saddles between mountain ranges. Wolves in interior Alaska have been documented covering more than 30 miles in a single day when following prey or searching out new territory after being pushed from a pack. Even grizzly bears, which are not migratory in the way caribou are, routinely maintain home ranges exceeding 1,000 square miles. The land north of the Alaska Range is not a wall. It is a corridor system, stitched together by river drainages: the Kantishna, the Tanana, the South Fork Koyukuk, the Chandalar, that animals have used to move north and south for far longer than the state of Alaska has existed as a political entity. Where the terrain does pinch, it pinches at predictable points. Mountain passes low enough to be snow-free by early summer. River crossings shallow enough to ford before autumn freeze-up. None of those pinch points are impassable to a large ungulate. They are simply unwatched. And bison have used this exact ground before, long before any human reintroduction program existed, to draw a boundary around them. Steppe bison, Bison priscus, the extinct Ice Age relative of the modern animal, ranged across the entirety of Alaska during the Pleistocene, from the interior all the way to the Arctic coastal plain, grazing the cold, dry grassland ecosystem paleontologists call the Mammoth Steppe. The mummified remains of one such animal, a bull nicknamed Blue Babe, were excavated near Fairbanks in 1979, roughly 36,000 years old, preserved almost intact in permafrost, right down to bite marks from the lion that killed it. The fossil record does not treat northern Alaska as marginal bison habitat, a place the species merely tolerated. It treats it as core range, occupied continuously for tens of thousands of years, only vacated when the species went locally extinct at the end of the Pleistocene, not because the land stopped being able to support bison, but because the grassland ecosystem that fed them collapsed and gave way to the boreal forest and tundra mosaic that covers the region today. That is the uncomfortable detail sitting underneath the modern mystery. The animals reintroduced in 1928 and 2015 were not placed in genuinely unfamiliar territory. They were placed in a narrow fraction of territory their own ancestors had already spent tens of thousands of years learning how to use. There is also the matter of the pipeline corridor itself. The Trans-Alaska Pipeline and the Dalton Highway that runs alongside it were built, deliberately, along the flattest, most passable line through the Brooks Range. Engineers chose that route in the 1970s precisely because it avoided the steepest terrain and the widest unfordable rivers. In doing so, they cut an 800-mile north-south corridor of cleared right-of-way through country that would otherwise be far harder for a large animal to cross efficiently. Caribou already use sections of that cleared corridor as travel routes, sometimes walking parallel to the road for miles at a stretch. A structure built to move oil south turned out, almost as a side effect, to also make it easier for anything large enough to use it to move in either direction. Reintroduced herds do not stay the size they started at, and Alaska's bison have grown enough in several locations to create exactly the kind of pressure that pushes animals toward the edges of a range and occasionally past it. The Farewell herd, established with 22 animals in 1965, has fluctuated between roughly 60 and 140 animals over the following decades, depending on winter severity and hunting quotas, more than a six-fold increase from its founding population at points in that record. The Delta herd has required active permit hunts for years specifically because it periodically exceeds the range's carrying capacity, too many animals competing for the same limited grazing along the river flats in late winter, the exact season when forage is scarcest and competition for it is most intense. The wood bison herd near Shagaluk, still young, was seeded in part with animals selected for a trait wood bison retain more strongly than their plains relatives, a documented tendency toward long-distance seasonal movement, inherited from ancestors that once ranged across the whole of boreal North America. This is not unique to Alaska, and that matters, because it means the underlying mechanism is well established elsewhere. In Yellowstone's bison population, young bulls pushed out of the core breeding herd during and after the rut are known to range independently for extended stretches, sometimes turning up well outside the park's official boundary. In country wildlife, managers had not expected them to reach. In Canada's Wood Buffalo National Park, dispersing bulls have been tracked moving through boreal forest corridors far from the main herd, covering distances that surprised researchers who assumed the species stayed close to established grazing grounds. Bison dispersal, in other words, is not exotic behavior invented for this story. It is a standard, repeatedly observed feature of bison biology, a mechanism that has, in other populations across North America, produced lone bulls turning up dozens or hundreds of miles from any known herd, in places wildlife agencies had confidently insisted bison don't go. You have to ask then, what happens to a young bull pushed out of Farewell or Delta during a hard winter, in a landscape laced with river corridors that lead eventually north toward exactly the kind of ground his species once called home? If you've made it this far, subscribe. This channel investigates the animals the official record insists were never there. There is one case that keeps surfacing in the margins of this story, and it deserves to be told carefully because it was never confirmed and never fully dismissed. In the fall of 2018, a small independent monitoring effort along the Chandalar corridor, north of the Yukon River, well outside any established bison range, in country normally studied for wolverine and lynx activity, picked up an unidentified large mammal on a remote trail camera. The image, captured at dusk in early September, showed a dark-bodied, heavily humped animal, too large and too broad-shouldered across the front quarters to be a moose calf, too solitary and too still in its posture to match a muskox, which tend to travel in loose groups even outside the breeding season. The biologist running the camera array, Inez Marlowe, flagged the image internally and, according to her own later account, spent close to 3 weeks trying to rule it out as something ordinary before she was willing to discuss it with anyone outside her own field team. What made the case different from a blurry dashcam clip was what happened next, almost by accident. A GPS-collared bull, tagged the previous year near Farewell as part of the same monitoring effort's expanded ungulate tracking work, had been transmitting unremarkable location data for months, short seasonal movements, the kind any bison biologist would expect. Then, in August 2018, his collar began registering pings that broke that pattern entirely. A steady walk north and east, crossing the Tanana River drainage, skirting the eastern flank of the White Mountains, gaining elevation through passes that put him well outside any range the herd's founding population had ever been recorded using. The signal weakened through September, dropped intermittently through the first weeks of October, and finally went silent for good. The collar's battery, or the collar itself, gone for reasons nobody could determine from a desk. Its last recorded position sat less than 40 miles from where the Chandalar trail camera had captured its unexplained image, weeks earlier. 40 miles is not proof. A drop signal is not a sighting, and a dark shape at dusk is not a positive identification. Marlowe herself, in the limited field notes that later circulated among a handful of colleagues, refused to call it confirmation of anything, and she was careful, almost stubborn, about saying so every time the subject came up. But the distance between the caller's last known point and the camera's unexplained image was close enough, and the timing close enough, that neither she nor anyone who later reviewed the raw data could rule out that they were describing the same animal. It did not stay to be photographed again. Whether or not that particular bull made the crossing, the underlying biology says an animal like him could, and the case for it runs deeper than most casual skeptics assume. Bison are built for exactly this kind of cold. Their fur is doubled, a dense wool undercoat beneath long guard hairs, thick enough that snow can settle on a bison's back for hours without melting because so little body heat escapes through the coat to begin with. Their ears and tails are proportionally shorter than those of cattle, a trait that minimizes surface area exposed to frostbite. The same evolutionary logic that gives Arctic foxes their compact, rounded ears compared to their desert-adapted cousins. Bison also carry substantial fat reserves built up over the short subarctic summer, and their metabolism slows measurably through the winter months, letting them subsist on lower-quality forage for longer stretches than a similarly sized animal without that seasonal adjustment. Then, there is the head. Bison cratering, the behavior of swinging their massive skull low and sweeping it side to side to clear snow down to buried forage, lets them access grass and sedge under snowpack that would stop an animal without the neck strength and skull mass to do it. Picture a snowplow blade mounted on a swivel, powered by an animal that can weigh over a ton, and you have a rough sense of what a bison's head and shoulders are doing to a snowbank that a moose would simply detour around rather than fight through. None of that is speculative. It is documented physiology, and it explains something the official skepticism tends to skip over entirely. The terrain north of the Yukon River is not too harsh for a bison to survive in. It may be, in the most literal biological sense, well within what the species evolved to handle, because it already did, for tens of thousands of years, before any human being ever drew a range boundary on a map and called anything past it impossible. The obvious challenge is fair, and it deserves a direct answer. If animals this large are moving through this landscape, where is the proof? Where are the photographs, the tracks, the scat, the bones? The first answer is coverage. Northern Alaska, north of the Yukon River, is larger than the state of Ohio and holds a human population in the low thousands, concentrated almost entirely along a single highway corridor and a handful of scattered villages. Wildlife cameras exist, but they are sparse and purpose-built, aimed at specific research targets: wolverines, lynx, caribou calving grounds, not laid out as a comprehensive detection grid for a species nobody expects to encounter there. A camera that isn't pointed at the right 100 square feet of forest, on the 1 week an animal passes through, records nothing at all. The second is classification bias. An observer who glimpses a large, dark, humped animal at dusk, in a region where the agency has said for decades that bison do not occur, has every incentive to write moose or muskox in their own head before they've even finished looking. Expectation edits perception in real time. Wildlife sightings are filtered through what an observer believes is possible, long before they're filtered through what was actually in front of them. The third is decomposition. In interior and Arctic Alaska, a carcass left in open country is stripped by wolves, foxes, ravens, and scavenging bears within days during the summer months, and buried entirely under snow within hours during winter. A single dead bison, hundreds of miles from anywhere with a permanent human presence, is not a discovery waiting to happen. It is a set of bones that will be scattered, buried, or simply gone before anyone with a reason to identify them ever walks past. The fourth is resourcing. Wildlife agencies fly survey transects and fund monitoring programs based on where they already expect to find a species, not on unconfirmed reports from unfamiliar territory. A single blurry video from a trucker on the Dalton highway does not, on its own, justify the cost of a helicopter survey across hundreds of square miles of roadless terrain, which means the absence of a follow-up investigation reflects budget priorities as much as it reflects any conclusion about what was or wasn't out there. And the fifth is scale itself. One or two dispersing bulls, in a landscape the size of northern Alaska, are not a population, and they leave a footprint too small for any existing survey method to reliably catch. They are a needle in a region with almost no one looking for needles, using tools designed to find something else entirely. Not enough to confirm, not enough to dismiss. That is not evasion. It is where the evidence, honestly weighed against the size of the territory and the limits of how it's actually monitored, genuinely sits. There is a sixth factor worth naming, because it is the quietest one. Institutional incentive. A wildlife agency that confirms an unmanaged bison population outside its established range takes on new obligations, new surveys to fund, new hunting regulations to draft, new habitat assessments to defend in public meetings, all for a handful of animals that may not persist long enough to justify the cost. There is no penalty administratively for leaving an ambiguous report unconfirmed. There is real cost to chasing one down and finding nothing. That asymmetry does not mean anyone is hiding anything. It means the incentive structure itself tilts, quietly and without any conspiracy behind it, toward letting isolated reports go unexamined, rather than toward resolving them one way or the other. Daryl Kesson still drives the Dalton Highway. He still passes milepost 222, 62 miles north of Coldfoot, where something crossed his headlights at 4:41 in the morning on a night that hit 31 below zero. He doesn't bring it up to other drivers anymore. He still has the clip, saved on an old phone he keeps meaning to replace. Nobody from Alaska Department of Fish and Game ever opened a file on it. There was no follow-up survey, no press statement, no line added to any range map, no asterisk beside the 4 established herds noting an unresolved report from 300 miles outside their boundaries. As far as the official record is concerned, nothing happened on the Dalton Highway that February morning, because nothing was ever confirmed to have happened at all. But the record was never built to capture animals that cross a line quietly, once in the dark, and don't come back to the same spot twice. It was built to track herds that stay roughly where they were put, collared, counted, surveyed on a schedule. It was not built for the fossil bull buried in Fairbanks permafrost, or for herds pressing against the edges of their own carrying capacity, or for a collar signal that walked north for 2 months and stopped 40 miles from an image nobody could quite explain. Every piece of this story points toward the same unresolved possibility, that somewhere between documented and impossible, there is a category the official record has no clean name for, and no real mechanism to search. Not documented is not the same thing as not there. It never has been. Somewhere north of the Yukon River, in the dark, along a river corridor its own ancestors walked 36,000 years before the first survey plane ever flew that route, something may still be moving. Or it isn't. Nobody has looked long enough, or hard enough, or with the right tools pointed in the right direction, to say for certain either way.